Hi everyone, welcome back to the Facts of Life lecture series. We're now going to start talking about physiology by talking about how plants live their lives and some of the processes that they use. So in our last lecture about plant diversity and evolution, we talked about how a major transition in the life of plants was moving from the water to land. And we had a lot of plants that were low-lying, like these bryophytes. And if we look at modern day plants, we still have bryophytes like these mosses, but we also have ferns, we have herbaceous plants, we have trees, and most of those plants, other than the bryophytes, can stand up and they can grow to be some of the tallest organisms on the planet. So how do plants stand up? Well, first we can look at the level of leaves, and we can try to figure out how plant leaves stay firm. And that's important because a firm surface is going to be able to collect more light for photosynthesis than a, a flaccid surface. So plants achieve this through passive diffusion. So basic, simple chemistry. They don't have to do anything active that requires energy going in. They simply have cells that are structured in this way. So they have rigid cell walls. They also have cell membranes that are semi-permeable. Their cells are semi-permeable, meaning water and small solutes or small particles can leave the cell, but bigger particles stay inside, structures stay inside the cell. And they also have this structure called a vacuole that holds water. So when we talk about passive diffusion, it's about the difference in concentration inside and outside of, in this case, a cell. And we can look down at this cartoon with a balloon as a model. That's also semi-permeable. So there are three types of solutions. We talk about them being hypertonic solutions, isotonic, and hypotonic. So we can start in the middle here with isotonic solutions. So those have the same concentration inside the cell and outside the cell, or in this cartoon down here, inside and outside the balloon. And so through random motion of molecules, you'll have water moving in between the cell or the balloon and the surrounding water, but there won't be any net change in water. So inside the cell is the same as outside the cell. And if we look at a plant cell, what we end up with is we have this rigid cell wall. We have the cell that's bound by the membrane inside the wall. So it's close to the cell wall, but it's not pushing up against that cell wall. And we end up with flaccid leaves in that case. And so what happens if the solution outside the cell is much more concentrated than inside the cell? Well, you can see that in this first picture on the left here, where we have many more solutes outside the cell. And so what's going to happen there is that any water from the cell is going to flow out into the surrounding solution. And that's basically an equilibrium process. So water flows out to make it more dilute outside the cell to try to get an equilibrium approach into an isotonic solution. And in a plant cell, that is basically a dead cell, because what happens is all that water leaves the cell, and we have the cell wall is still rigid, but that cell membrane is shrunken inside the cell wall, and it's what's called a plasmolized cell. Okay, so the actual typical state for a plant is to have a turgid leaf. And so that's when it's hypotonic. So that means that there is more water relative to solutes, so it's less concentrated outside of the cell than inside the cell. And so water is going to flow in, and it's got this structure called a vacuole that holds that water and basically pushes that cell membrane right up against the cell wall leading to these really firm leaf surfaces. And here's a picture on an actual plant, so you can see what that looks like, where you have this turgor pressure inside the water vacuole that's pushing that cell wall membrane right up against the cell wall, and we have these rigid leaves, or really firm leaves. Now, when the solution becomes different, even in an isotonic solution, we end up having water flow out of that vacuole. And so it shrinks, and if we look at the leaves themselves, they're wilted. So that's what's happening at the level of leaves. But what we're really interested in is them being able to stand up. We have things like the California redwoods, which are the tallest plants on Earth. They reach heights of more than 350 feet. I mean, look at how tiny this person looks right up next to that tree. It's amazing. So how do they accomplish this feat? Well, they have vascular tissue. And we talk about vascular tissue as being really important for moving water and nutrients to different parts of the plant. But another thing that it does is it provides the structure, a strong structure for the plants to be able to stand up. And it does it through the xylem. So we talked about xylem and phloem as being the two vascular tissues that plants use. In xylem, we have what's called lignin, which is just a really strong structural material that strengthens the inner cell walls of the plants that allows them to get that height. And for this reason, we have two types of growth in plants. We have what we usually think of as growth, which in plants we call primary growth, where plants become taller, they grow higher, and their branches elongate, and that's one way to grow. And then there's secondary growth, and that's the increased girth or width of the woody tissue. And so so that's growing out. And because that happens in a generally predictable way, we can count the rings on a tree, basically count that xylem, the rings of xylem, to see how old the tree is. Okay, so the next thing I'll talk about is the sensory biology of plants. And this is really interesting. It's how plants respond to their environment. And a lot of this sensory biology is mediated by a single hormone called auxin. And so the first one we'll talk about is one you've probably seen before, which is plants growing towards light. So you can see here we're bending this stem away from light, leading the new growth to grow towards light. And because plants do this, some scientists consider this a primitive version of sight, because plants are able to tell light and dark using phototropism. But here's what happens. Basically, in regular, just simple growth, when light is coming from above, we have auxin made here, and then moving down the stem. And it diffuses down that shoot, and it stimulates growth down the shoot. But sometimes, often actually, light is coming from the side. And so if we have light coming in, then the opposite side of the light is going to accumulate auxin. And that's going to stimulate more and more growth in that opposite side of the light, causing this bend to occur. And as the plant grows more on one side, it bends toward that light and continues to grow towards light, towards the direction of the light. But that's not the only way that plants respond to their environment. They can also grow towards the earth in a term called gravitropism or geotrophism. So basically, plant roots are going to be growing towards the ground, so they're called positively geotropic or gravitrophic, and plant stems, the above ground part of the plant, is negatively gravitrophic or geotrophic, because they grow in the opposite direction of the Earth. And this is a process that's also mediated by auxin. So, so we see that same bend occur where auxin accumulates, and then we have increased growth in the opposite direction of that bend. And in roots, the bend is towards the ground. In stems and leaves, it's away from the ground. Okay, so then we have what's called thigiotropism. And we'll start by talking about what happens when a vine crawls up a leaf. Again, we have auxin playing an important role. And thigiotropism just means touch. So this is plants growing in response to touch. So the plant cells touching each other, touching any other surface, have less auxin than the plant cells that aren't in direct contact with another surface. So if we look at this stem that this vine is growing up, those cells that are touching the plant have less auxin. They're growing less than the ones that are away from the stem here. And that's going to cause this growth towards it, and it causes a spiral up that you see is characteristic of vines. There's another kind of thigiotropism that doesn't have anything to do with the direction of touch or this auxin growth, and that's this nastic movement, which is pretty fun. If you guys haven't done this, a lot of plants in the pea family will do this, where if you touch them, they suddenly lose turgor pressure, and it causes them to fold up. And that is something related to other aspects of plants' natural history, including some protective functions. So speaking of protecting themselves, there's a lot of animals and other organisms out there that like to eat plants. That's the reason that plants are the base of many food webs. But the plants also protect themselves. So they have physical defenses like trichomes, which are these spines that you'll see on plant surfaces. They have thorns, which we all know what thorns are. They also have waxy leaves that are harder to actually chew. They have what's called delayed greening. So here we have not very much chlorophyll in really young, tender leaves. And because chlorophyll is more nutritious for herbivores, they prefer to eat plants that have chlorophyll. It's relatively distasteful to have these lesser photosynthetic pigments like carotene and xanthophyll in the leaves. And so they're less likely to be eaten than green leaves. They're also very tender, making them easy to eat. And so when leaves are very young, some plants won't have a lot of chlorophyll in their leaves until they start to get a little tougher, and then they'll move that expensive molecule of chlorophyll into their leaf surface and really do more photosynthesis now that they're protected more from the herbivores. There are also chemical defenses. So we have what we call plant secondary compounds. Those tend to be toxic or distasteful to discourage especially insects from eating them. And plants will also attract the natural enemies of insects, especially to the plant with volatile compounds. So essentially, this is a caterpillar comes in, does a little munching on a leaf, and the plant sends out these molecules that are in the air, and it's a signal to a wasp to come to that plant and eat up that caterpillar. Really quite interesting. And then there are what we call indirect defenses. So this is where plants will actually invest energy into providing food or shelter for these natural enemies of herbivores in exchange for defense. This happens a lot with ants. As you can see here, this is an example where this is a wild cotton plant, and its main herbivore is this caterpillar. And the caterpillar has an interesting defense of itself where it will hang on one piece of silk when it sees an ant, because this is what the ants do when they find the caterpillar. And simply by not even killing the caterpillar, but causing them to spend time silking, the plant gains a fitness benefit, meaning that it survives more, it has more offspring by having ants on the plant. And so it will produce nectar in little pots outside of the flower to attract ants to come and collect that nectar and protect the plant against this caterpillar. We see even more extreme examples of this in the tropics, where you have plants like this bullhorn acacia, which has a structure that's a hollowed out thorn that ants will chew a little hole in and then colonize. These plants will also produce these little bodies on the end of the plants that are just for feeding ants. And that's their only real defense. They don't have a lot of chemical defenses. And they end up being quite successful. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about is fruit ripening. And this isn't for all plants, but we call these I can't pronounce it. I'm sorry. Climacteric fruit are the solid lines, and the non-climacteric fruit here are the dotted lines. And so we have, all plants have respiration. They also have growth. And some plants, like these climacteric plants, also produce ethylene. Ethylene is a signaling molecule that signals ripening. And so you can add ethylene, you can expose some of these plants like tomatoes to ethylene and cause ripening to occur. And there's a lot of processes that happen there. There's changes in cell wall structure. There's more and more pigment, which is why you start to see this red color that signals to the seed dispersers that the plant is ready to be eaten. It's sweet. You also have these sweet flavor and aromatic volatiles and conversion of starches into sugars. And so if you've ever eaten fruit that's not ripe yet, you'll know that it's very starchy. It can sometimes make your mouth feel very dry to eat something like that. Other plants still have respiration. They still have growth. Their ethylene production doesn't change during the ripening process. They still ripen, it's just that's not the signaling molecule. Okay, that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, please use the discussions tab of Canvas to ask them. Remember, that's your space to talk to each other and to me. I will be available in my WebEx room during my office hours as always, but you can email me at other times if you have questions. And thank you for your attention. Bye.